Jan, dear Mr. Fabik, Mr. Chituri, Dr. Narayan, dear Professor Dieter, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Before we peep into the future, title is Where's the Economy Going? It's always good to start by examining the present first. India's economic development has regained momentum since 2014 after a few years of sluggish growth, and it's currently one of the fastest growth engines in the world. There were some major achievements, including India's 30-point jump to join the top 100 countries in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business index and the upgrade of India's sovereign credit rating by the global credit rating agency Moody's for the first time since 2004. The Indian government has pushed through tough but necessary reforms like demonetization and GST. And I remember that just a few months ago we had this big event checking together with MMA, where are we standing with the implementation of GST issue. So that I still do remember well. But the Indian economy is still facing major challenges. Like I have a few. One of it would be, I guess, in the anti-corruption index of Transparency International, the ranking of India is not as good as in other charts. And another challenge is the creation of jobs for the young generation. In India, almost half of all young workers are employed as wage laborers without a written contract. That's at least what ILO is reporting in the Global Employment Trends for the Youth 2017. In the coming years, more and more young people will enter the job market, while the skills the economy needs are changing rapidly because of digitalization and automatization. Teach them the right skills and prepare them for the job market, as well as provide them with proper jobs, in my mind, only one of the biggest challenges of the Indian economy in the future. But as you know, the challenges for India ahead are diverse and multifaceted. Therefore, I'm looking forward to the discussion coming up this evening on the topic, Where from here, Indian economy? It's indeed a pleasure to welcome you all here, and I'm anticipating an insightful discussion between our distinguished experts. On behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, let me thank Mrs. Chituri, President of the MMA, and Group Captain Vijaya Kumar, the Executive Director of MMA, as well as the entire team from MMA for the conceptualization and organization of this event tonight. The cooperation between CAS and MMA is one of our most long-standing, trustful and fruitful partnerships here in India, and we are since 50 years active in India. That's why maybe the logo looks a bit uncommon to you with a colorful surrounding, but it's still the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. So 50 years in India, and you have honored our collaboration from the side of MMA with the inauguration of the Konrad Adenauer Library, what we just witnessed here. Symbolically, we will go to the real place soon also, and I've been there before. It's marvelous what is coming up there. Congratulations already now to MMA. It's a pleasure and privilege to have such an excellent partnership with you, and I'm really looking forward to new milestones in our future. May I also say a few words about the organization that I'm privileged to work for in India, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Most of you may be aware of it. It's a German political foundation, and we are inactive in India, as I said, 50 years. In other countries, and that's about 120 of the world, we are also active, maybe not that long in some of them, and we have offices in 85 offices. The dialogue on the principles of the social market economy is one of the core focus areas of our international cooperation. We are convinced that the concept of the social market economy can serve as a guiding framework for a global linkage between growth and social justice. The principles of the social market economy aim to establish an order striving for justice. In many states, these principles might provide an orientation guide in terms of a sustainable economic and social development. The Adenauer Foundation defines its work in this field as an offer to share experiences for others to adopt or alter what suits them in the context of their own economic policy. Social market economy, as you are all aware, is a combination of a free market operated with state provisions for those unable to work, such as elderly or unemployed people. It is a conjunction of a free market capitalist economy system alongside social policies which aim to establish justice and create a sustainable society. Or to make it short, let me quote the Indian philosopher and economist Amartya Sen: "Economic growth without investment in human development is unsustainable and unethical." Once again, my thanks go to MMA, to the organization, to all of you joining us tonight, speakers and guests. It is my great pleasure to warmly welcome you all in here and to you to this event, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. N. Satyamurthy is the Director, Observer Research Foundation, ORF, of Chennai chapter. In the course of his job, he has been studying India's southern Indian Ocean neighbors, namely Maldives and Sri Lanka, as well as the SAARC countries. Ladies and gentlemen, I now invite Mr. Satyamurthy to present the overview of this seminar.
Good evening, everybody. When we are discussing this title or the subject matter, we had a very broad idea of what we wanted to do. Then, how to encapsulate it in the title. We thought about discussing various other related titles, but the way Indian economy is based, we decided wire from here. It could have been wire from yesterday, wire from today, wire from tomorrow. That's the kind of situation we are in. Yes, there is growth, GDP growth, etc. There is also, see, for instance, when we are discussing, the GDP was down. Today we are told it is high. It has stabilized. Tomorrow we don't know what is going to happen. Likewise, there is an overall discourse going on. Just as Mr. Rimile also mentioned, job creation is becoming a pointer. Growth with jobs or growth without jobs, that is becoming another issue. And putting money into the hands of individual. Is it happening? See, we are now past 25 years. In 1991, if we use it as a benchmark for economic reforms, we are in the 28th year, right? So what we have achieved, what we have not achieved, and some of these things, social sector indicators, in the early years of economic reforms, we used to be told socialist pattern was the one that did us in. But today, that is one of the earliest comments of Finance Minister of Narasimha Rao after the Congress lost power in 1996 was, we have to look at reforms with a human face. The present government is not saying that, but they are also only expanding the base of those social sector reforms and also investing more on social sector reforms which they may have inherited or which they are looking at afresh. So where do we go from here is a question. Basically, how are we going to reassess, remanage, or should we look back and look into the future and revisit the entire economic policy, say this is taking this as the midterm review. If we say that 25, 26 years, 28 years of economic reforms have passed and we have got all kinds of governments at the center, I mean, in terms of political ideology, and ideologies have changed. Congress with a social background came and they were the ones who introduced reforms. A market economy driven BJP, or that is what we were given to believe when they were in the opposition. They took forward the reforms, yes. They are also readjusting the reforms or the economic policy to the Indian needs. So the question arises whether we have to revisit all these things to revive and look at or create a new economic framework or economic policy for the India. Present day India, yes, there was a crisis from which economic reforms of what we understood then pulled us out. Today we are in a different situation where this balancing of market forces, the demand for more investments, FDIs, have to be always compensated with what the society needs, what the individual needs, and if nothing else, to put it a little crudely and though not very accurately, the demands of the elections, electoral politics in a democracy. That cannot be missed away also. But that's also a social reality. I'm not talking about political reality alone, that's a social reality. And governments in democracies or whatever are run by people for their own decision, for the people. So where we go from here has always been a question. Every now and again, this nation has asked over the last 25 years, let's say the previous year, decades. Maybe we thought we would start off here, now that we have got another year to go for the elections, hopefully, Lok Sabha elections, and then again we are going to have new patterns. I'm not talking about change of leadership or change of party, no. So stability of some political stability has been achieved for the first time in the last 25 years. After 1989 and 2014, we got the first stable government at the center. So we thought that this would be a very good time to review the performance of the economy, not from the historic perspective, but how far and where should we be leading. Once we decided, Group Captain Vijay and I decided on this kind of a thing, with Mr. Thomas was sipping in with IIM background. It became clear who should be the speakers. The speakers chose themselves. Not only because of their vast and varied experience in the government in the finance section, without reference to anything, they happen to be at the helm of economic affairs in this country for two specific governments. That makes a lot of difference, and they are in the past. They don't have to defend any past policies as the present day economic advisor to the government may have to do for obvious reasons. And they have been both very, very actively involved in revisiting, reviewing, and or following the present day economic trends, moods, policies, and framework. Dr. C. Rangarajan and Dr. S. Narayan. So with that, we thought we have a framework and the right speakers to kickstart a discourse which may start in Chennai, but it may have to be taken over across the country at the appropriate time and maybe over the next 1 year, so that a greater clarity about thought will happen. For a simple reason, as we all know, this budget, union budget, has moved away from figure crunching. GDP was not a relevant thing, we were told by editorial writers, but today we are again talking about GDP. Is that the right benchmark to assess the performance? Banking was supposed to be the backbone of economy. Even until recently, it is becoming a burden. Is it right or wrong? Where are the... all of us think that we know the problems. Even granting that we all as common men, citizens, we think that we know the problems. I don't know we know. There are experts who know how it functioned and how it functions. But definitely they can suggest the cures, not only for the banking problems facing the banking sector, but for the entire economy. And we hope we will come in somewhere and it is here. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Mr. K.C. John is the president of IIMA, Alumni Association of the Chennai chapter. I now invite Mr. K.C. John to present an overview of the Indian economy.
Distinguished dignitaries on the dais, especially it's a rare privilege for a student to stand in front of his guru. And I'm reminded of a Chinese proverb when I stand here. He who asks a question is fool for 5 minutes. He who does not ask a question remains a fool forever. Especially in the context of Dr. Rangarajan, who used to reward students for asking a good question. Yeah? His educational philosophy when we were at IMA was the uncreative mind can spot wrong answers, but it takes a very creative mind to spot wrong questions. I must confess that I didn't get an A grade in Dr. Rangarajan's courses. And the reason was that he would spot all the wrong questions which I used to. But he instilled in all his students a lifelong quest for what people think of as the moment of discovery is the discovery of the question. Thank you, sir. So let me raise 5 questions. And I'm hoping that at the end of the 5 questions, Dr. Rangarajan would revise his opinion about me. Question number 1. Can India double her GDP in the next 5 years? And let me amplify. The Economic Survey of India 2018 pegged the provisional estimate of India GDP for 2016-17 at $2.3 trillion. China's GDP in 2005 was 2.3 trillion. China doubled its GDP in 5 years to 5.1 trillion in 2009 and joined the economic superpower club. What will it take for India? Given the context Satyamurthy Saab set up, we are free to think and reimagine the future. So what would it take for India to double the GDP in the next 5 years and become a 5 trillion economy? So that's number 1 question which I'm raising. Question number 2. What kind of growth and development will promote social democracy? Indian Constitution promised its citizen liberty, equality, and fraternity. They form the unity of Trinity in the sense that to divorce one from the other is to defeat the very purpose of democracy. If we look at some of the recent writings and publications, we find that India is witnessing a rise of inequality, both in terms of income as well as wealth. Piketty and Chancel came and released their study, which says that top 1% of Indians earn 22% of the entire income pool. They captured nearly a third of all the national growth since 1980. India has the biggest gap between the growth of income for the top 1% and growth of income for the population as a whole. If we look at the income equality, Oxfam International released its report in January 2018 titled Reward Work, Not Wealth, and it said that in India about 73% of the wealth generated last year went to the richest 1%, while 67 crore comprising the poorest half of the population experienced 1% growth in their wealth. In last 12 months, the wealth of the elite top 1% has increased by 20,913 billion, which is equivalent to the annual central budget of the Government of India. So what kind of growth and development will promote social democracy? That's my second question. My third question is, how should India carry out structural transformation that yields sustainable expansion of economy? All of us know that India is a service-led economy. Service accounted for 54% of the GDP from 2011-12 to 2017-18. Incidentally, all of us know that 2011-12 is when the new series of national income came into being. But all services cover only a quarter of employment. And we talked about jobless growth. So what do? Primary sector, which is agriculture, forestry, and fisheries, it contributes about 18% of GDP, while it covers more than half of employment recorded workforce. Manufacturing sector remains largely stable, both in terms of its contribution to GDP and employment at 15%. Now, if we disaggregate the gross value added growth since 2011-12, the situation accentuates a bit more. Three main services subsectors contribute 67% of the growth in national value added since 2011-12 to now. These subsectors are finance, insurance, and real estate. Number two, professional services, trade, hotels, transport, and communications. And number three, public administration and defense. 43% of the contribution to the GVA growth comes from the latter two subsectors. Agriculture, unfortunately, even though it covers more than 50% of employment, contributes only 6% of the GVA growth. And if we combine the index numbers of crop production as well as agricultural GVA between crop and livestock, what is emerging is that Indian crop production sector has been languishing from the last one decade, 2010-11 onwards. It's the livestock sector which has been the saving grace, and real income or real GVA has grown there substantially. We all learned from Dr. Rangarajan that fundamental mechanisms of growth are twofold. Either you carry out a structural shift of transformation, where you shift from traditional low productivity sectors towards modern parts of the economy with high productivity. And the second one is the neoclassical theory. Growth depends on the accumulation of fundamental capabilities, including human capital, education and skills, institutions and governance, which lays out the rule of the game for everybody and creates a level playing field. And third, last but not the least, entrepreneurship and innovation. Economic Survey of 2018 described education and health as a growing concern and worrisome, and we need to figure out what we can do. Manufacture played a special role. If we look at East Asian economies and Chinese economies, it played a critical role in structural transformation due to the productivity dynamics, labor absorption, and tradability. Whereas Economic Survey of India in 2017 sharply focused on the deindustrialization, rapid deindustrialization of Indian economy. And recently, Danny Roderick from Harvard University has carried out a cross-country study and which shows that promoting reindustrialization will be difficult. And we can see that it is being corroborated by Make in India, where it is difficult to take it off. All this needs to also be put in a context in terms of fourth industrial revolution, which is knocking the door. And what we find, we were driving and we were discussing with Dr. Rangarajan that the non-linearly converging technologies are creating the fourth industrial revolution. And it is being driven by advanced automation, cloud computing, Internet of Things, industrial robotics, artificial intelligence, and blockchains, the Internet of Thinking. Should India structural transformation leapfrog from Make in India to lead India to the fourth industrial revolution? Because that's a great opportunity which India has, where we need not worry about getting into the manufacturing sector, but leapfrog. My fourth question is, should we treat poverty as a stock or a flow concept in India's development journey? Undoubtedly, all of us know that poverty in India has steadily declined. 1993, it was 45% of the population. 2004, it was 37% of population. 2011, it was 24% of population. World Bank, in its latest report in 2015, said that as the social conditions change, we need to redefine the poverty line, and they adjusted it for the purchasing parity, power 2. And so the 1.25 poverty line is now equivalent to 1.9. $2 poverty line is equivalent to 3.1. National Commission for Enterprise in the Unorganized Sector, which came out with its report, suggested that 77% of population still live in poverty. Numbers are increasing. It increased from 732 million in 1994 to 800 million in 2000 to 836 million in 2005. Certainly poverty has reduced since 1990 when we liberalized the economy. But the question is, should we look at the aggregative view of poverty that dominates the policy discussion in terms of uplifting the population above the poverty line? Or should we be asking questions which we fight shy to ask, kind of a thing? And the questions are, how do people come to be poor in the first place? Was everyone who is born today born into poverty? Do we need to go beyond the class, caste, gender dynamics to understand poverty in India? Recent evidences from the grassroots suggest that it's a two-way dynamic process where people are getting uplifted from the poverty, but equally large number of people are falling into the poverty. And recently Niti Aayog estimated that almost 70 million people slip into poverty each year due to ailments. Poverty is only an illness away for majority of Indians. So what we need to relook at is essentially the dynamic and two-faced nature of poverty and understand what we would need to do to ensure that those who are kind of lifted upwards stay there and we remove people from not falling inside the poverty line. And the question which we need to ask is whether the time for universal basic income has arrived, so that we worry about how do we ensure a standard quality of life for everybody. My last question is, what should be a roadmap for sustainable financial system in India? We are hurtling from one bank fraud to another diamond trader and yet another weakness in the public bank systems, besides the non-performing assets. But I wish to raise a fundamental issue here, that is credit to GDP ratio. There is a strong empirical linkages established between finance and sustainable development goals. Empirical studies have indicated that for every 10% increase in credit to GDP ratio, it reduces poverty by 2 to 3 percentage points. We know that overall credit to GDP ratio in India is in the range of 65 to 70%. However, when we look at the disaggregated sense into the disadvantaged communities in urban and rural area, we find that the credit to GDP ratio is around 10% or lower. Despite a reasonable number of access points, financial depth indicators are not looking pretty good and they are weak. Access to credit for MSME. Since MMA is membership comprises of MSMEs, credit to GDP ratio also need to look at what does MSME get from it. The economic survey of 2018 suggests that total outstanding credit distribution till November 2017 was 26,041 billion. 82.6% of that went to large enterprises and only 17.4% to the MSMEs. So not only we are not able to create a sustainable development, India is signatory to the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030, we are not able to ensure that credit flows to the right sorts of people. And that's the challenge in terms of what do we do to raise incomes for 800 million people living on less than $2 or the revised $3.1 per day? How do we generate livelihood for the 12 million young Indians entering the workforce every year? What do we do to generate natural resource base, increase dependence on renewable and clean energy, and improved quality of air and water at a time of climate change? To summarize the 5 questions, can India double her GDP in the next 5 years? What kind of growth and democracy will promote social democracy? How should India carry out structural transformation that yields sustainable expansion of economy? Should we treat poverty as a stock or a flow concept in our development journey in India? What should be a roadmap for a sustainable financial system in India? And I'm sure with the distinguished speakers here, we would have clarity. They would help us to visualize what kind of India we want for the future. And I would request them, as re-engineering suggests, that you are not constrained by the past. And so what we are trying to look at from our distinguished guest is, if anything were possible, how would India look like in 2022? How would India look like in 2030? Personally, I am hoping that my guru, Dr. Rangarajan, would revise his opinion about me and say, John, with graying of your beard, you have learned to raise some right questions. There is ample scope for improvement. Thank you, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my privilege to introduce our chief guest. He needs no introduction, but the protocol demands. Dr. C. Rangarajan is an Indian economist and a distinguished former member of the Parliament and ex-governor of the Reserve Bank of India and chairman of the Madras School of Economics. Dr. C. Rangarajan was awarded the Padma Vibhushan in 2002 by the then President of India. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our chief guest, Dr. C. Rangarajan, as I invite him to address the gathering.
Friends, my thanks to the organizers for providing me this opportunity to interact with you. I have some thoughts on what direction and what steps India should take if India is to move in the right direction in the next few decades. Before doing that, I suppose it is also important to understand where we stand, what our concerns are at the moment, and what our worries are. John has reversed the role. I always thought it was the prerogative of the professor to ask questions. He has asked the right questions. Congratulations. But I'm not going to answer them directly. I will keep the questions that you have asked in my mind and describe the events as they have happened. And when I want to say something about what directions we should take in the future, I will come back to some of the concerns that you have raised. 1991 marked a paradigm shift in India's economic policy. The country faced an acute economic crisis triggered by a severe balance of payments problem, and the crisis was converted into an opportunity to bring about fundamental changes in India's economic policy. There is a common thread running through the various measures introduced since July 1991, and that is to improve the productivity and efficiency of the system by injecting a greater element of competition. And this is sought to be achieved by removing the barriers to entry and growth. While the changes in industrial policy, which meant the dismantling of the wide network of controls and licenses that we had, were aimed at increasing the domestic competitiveness of Indian industry, the changes in foreign trade policy were aimed at improving the international competitiveness of Indian firms, subject to the degree of protection offered by tariffs, which are also being brought down steadily. The private sector is being given a larger space in which to operate. Some of the areas reserved for the public sector are now thrown open to the private sector. It must also be pointed out that this does not mean a diminishing the role of the state. The role of the state as a producer of marketable goods and services has come down. On the other hand, the role of the state as a regulator, as a provider of public goods and services such as primary health and primary education remain important. And that is why it is somewhat cryptically remarked, more market does not mean less government, but different government. The break with the past, in substance, came in three ways. First, as I said, the dismantling of the large number of controls, which virtually determined what to produce, where to produce, how much to produce. Second, the redefinition of the state and its role. And third, the integration of the Indian economy with the rest of the world, giving up the import substitution policy and integrating with the rest of the world. How do you assess the performance of the economy over the last 2.5 decades? When you assess the performance of the economy, there are three things that you want to look at. One is the pace and pattern of growth. The second, the stability parameters to which it conformed. And third, the distributional aspects of the growth process. In the first 3 decades after India's independence, the Indian economy grew at an average rate, annual growth rate of 3.5%. At that time, India's population was growing at 2.2%. The per capita income was growing at only 1.3%. In the 1980s, the growth rate picked up. It exceeded 5%, but it ended up in the crisis of 1991-92 too. In the post-liberalization period, the average annual rate of growth from 92-93 to the current period comes to about 6.6%. But post-2200, the rate of growth had picked up, and as you all recall, between 2005-06 and 2007-08, the average annual rate of growth of the economy was 9.4%. If you add the next 3 years and look at the total period of 5 years, the average annual rate of the growth of the economy was between 8 and 9%. Since 1213, the growth rate has fallen. And that is a matter of concern. It is true that, as was remarked by one of the earlier speakers, that the rate of growth of the Indian economy still compares very favorably with what is happening in the rest of the world. But it is certainly operating below our potential and below what our requirement is. So one of the concerns now is really how to get out of the low phase of growth or relatively lower rate of growth of the economy and get onto the higher growth path. Let me come back to that. The second issue that I raised was about the stability conditions. The stability conditions are related to three things. One, balance of payment stability. That is a current account deficit which is manageable. And if you look at India's performance in terms of the external sector, I would say that is one of the success stories of the liberalization period. Prior to 1992-93, we had gone to the IMF 5 times at periodic intervals. Post 92-93, we have been able to manage, and in fact, even the hiccup that we had in 2013 was resolved out of our own efforts. It is true that the low current account deficit in the last few years has also been helped by the fall in the crude oil prices. Now that the crude oil prices have gone up, the current account deficit this year could be 2% of GDP, even though it has remained below 1.1% or around 1.1% for the last 3 years. The second is price stability. We have had years during this period of fairly high inflation too. There are some years in which it has come down, but there are at least 3 to 4 years in which the inflation rate is high, and therefore that is one area in which one has really to be careful about. But after the introduction of the new monetary policy framework, we do see a substantial reduction in the inflation rate, even though, once again, I must say, the reduction in the inflation has been helped by the lower crude oil prices. The third stability parameter relates to the fiscal deficit. I have always held that the FRBM mandate of 3% of the GDP as the central government's fiscal deficit has a lot of logic in it, and I would always urge that the government be guided by that. I'm not saying that if in 1 or 2 years you deviate from the path, it does not matter. But continuously deviating from that mandate does create credibility problem. It is true that we have come down in terms of the fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP, but that's an area in which I think we must continue to show vigilance. And the third area that I wanted to talk about is the distributional implications of the rate of growth of the economy. After all, the question is, who benefits from growth? And John raised some issues regarding poverty and so on and so forth. Yes, in some sense, our development in relation to, in the social area, is perhaps not as impressive as it is in terms of the growth performance. India ranks something like 131 out of 188 nations in terms of the Human Development Index. It is also true that even in relation to some of the health indicators, we are performing worse than some of the other countries whose per capita income is even lower than that ours. But it is also true that whether in terms of health or education, you can find many indicators where the performance has been very good. Take, for example, even life expectancy. Many people do not know that, or may not recall very precisely, that in 1947, the life expectancy in India was 33 years. It is today about 65 or 66 years. Therefore, there has been progress. But as I mentioned earlier, the progress has been less than our expectations, and really we need to address that issue. Now I come to the question, where do we go from here? In some sense, as I said, the growth performance has been good, but there is a slowdown in growth, and what needs to be done? To me, growth is an important factor. We must sustain the economy, and we must make the economy grow at a high rate. People talk about the potential rate of growth of the economy. What is the potential rate of growth of the economy? I mean, if you mean by the word potential, what the maximum that you can achieve, certainly we have shown for over a 6-year period, actually from 2005-6, the average annual rate of the growth of the economy has been between 8 and 9%. And therefore, I certainly believe that we have shown the capability, and you must get back to that level of that rate of growth in the future. I say this because I will explain it if I have the time later, that growth is important even from the point of view of social development. Growth is a thing which will give you the surpluses and the resources that are required in order to improve some of the social indicators with which we are concerned. So what can be done in order to get the economy back into the high growth path. I think our immediate concern must be to end this phase of low growth. It's a simple proposition in economics that the rate of growth of the economy is determined by two factors. One is the amount of investment that you make, and the other is the productivity of capital. The famous Harrod-Domar growth equation said G, growth rate, is equal to the investment rate or the savings rate divided by the incremental capital output ratio. The incremental capital output ratio is the reverse or the inverse of the productivity of capital. Incremental capital output ratio means the amount of capital that you require in order to produce 1 unit of output. The greater the amount of capital required to produce 1 unit of output, the productivity is less. In as late as 2011-12, India's investment rate was equal to 33.5% of GDP. Today, I think the 2017-18, the estimate is 28.5%. It is a sharp decline in the investment rate which has been responsible for the decline in the growth rate that we have seen in the recent period. Why? Why has the investment rate fallen? I think we really need to introspect and see that the pickup in the investment rate goes back to the level that we had earlier. In fact, with 38% in 2008 and an incremental capital output ratio of 4:1, it is simple logic to derive that we had a rate of growth. It is not surprising that we had a rate of growth of 9.4% in that year. There are several things that need to be addressed in this particular context. One is, as I say, investment is an act of faith in the future. And therefore, we need to create the climate and the sentiment for investment in the country. And that is a result of not only the economic factors, but also the non-economic factors. Therefore, the investment sentiment must be raised in the country. And also at the same time, we really need to see that the resources that are required in order to support that investment comes. In fact, there has been a fall not only in the investment rate, but also there has been a fall in the savings rate of the economy from 34% to something like 29% now. And therefore, that is one of the reasons why there is the financial resources that are required to support the investment is also falling. Well, if the investment sentiment is low, then the fall in the savings rate doesn't matter because the resources are not needed. But we must take the occasion to raise the investment rate and also raise the savings rate. True. The problem with the banking system, to which a reference was made, is an issue. But we need to resolve that particular problem. The solution to the non-performing assets will have to be found. Sometimes it so happens that the boom that we had seen in 2005 to 8 itself becomes the cause of the problem. There's an old saying in banking which says, bad loans are sown in good times. Because everything looks rosy, everything looks optimistic, and every project is granted. And that is what has really happened in a sense that the capacity building up at that particular time was so large that it took many years for the capacity to be fully utilized. And I hear even now from industry people that the capacity utilization is still less than 80%, and therefore there is still scope. Therefore, the problem needs to be resolved. And the issues relating to the industry needs to be looked at properly. Now, John raised the question about the structural changes. These structural changes are bound to happen. The role of the primary sector will come down. It has to come down. In the United States, agriculture constitutes only 5% of the GDP, or even less, I think 3% of the GDP. as the economy moves forward, this is what will happen. But what has happened in India is that traditionally the primary sector was dominant, then the secondary sector, which is the manufacturing sector, was dominant, then the service sector was dominant. Somehow we have skipped, and we have moved from the primary sector to the service sector. But that is also a reflection of what is happening with respect to technology in the world. Because many things that were described as industry before are now treated as service. And in the previous periods, the manufacturer did everything, packaging, everything, and put it, and it is part of manufacturing. Now it is decomposed, and is part of it is manufacturing, part of it is services. And it is happening all over the world. It is not something very peculiar to India. I do still think that we need to address especially the problems of agriculture. Because it so happens that the transformation of the Indian economy in terms of the rate of growth has not brought about the same structural changes in the total employment or the total population, the livelihoods of the total population. What has happened is that the faster rate of growth has only absorbed the increasing population in the urban areas, and the people in the rural area continue to remain dependent on agriculture, even though the share of agriculture has come down. The question was also raised about job creation. Let me also answer that. Job creation is not something independent of the rate of growth of the economy. You can't think in terms of creating jobs in the country without the growth of the economy. The rate of the growth of the economy and the job creation are more or less synonymous, even though there is a rider that I would like to add. It also depends upon the pattern of growth of the economy besides the rate of growth of the economy. The job creation, I want to make one more point there. Growth at a particular point in time can happen because of new investment or better utilization of the existing investment. Whatever growth that we are seeing now today in India is result of the better utilization of capacity. Job creation occurs primarily when growth occurs as a result of new investment. It is a new investment which will also create jobs, and better utilization of capacity will create additional jobs, but not at the rate at which growth is occurring because of new investment. I believe, a question was asked whether we should rethink about our own strategy. I do believe that what we decided in the 1991, and I think I was part of the team which essentially moved in that direction, I think it's the right decision. And I also believe that we need to move more in the direction of improving the efficiency of the country. Some of the recent changes, like at the insurance code, FDI reforms, and also the GST are important. And GST naturally creates certain tensions because it's a fundamental change as far as the indirect taxation is concerned. And in all countries where it has been introduced, the first few years have been very difficult years. Therefore, we need to do it. But we need to look at every area of the economy and see where competition can be introduced. And where competition cannot be there, then I think the pricing problem should be transparent. The way in which prices are determined must be transparent. In the field of agriculture, once again, I believe that we really need to introduce some reforms. People talk about the distress in agriculture. In fact, the distress in agriculture that people are talking about in the last 1 or 2 years is not so much because of the lack of production, but as much as because of the fall in prices. That means the production had increased and the economy is so balanced, even a small increase in production has resulted in a fall in prices. My own suggestion for that is really that the government should intervene and procure the excess supply over normal so that the market mechanism itself will correct and bring the prices to the appropriate level. Therefore, as I said, we really need to stick on to the reform path and introduce further reforms in the same direction. But at the same time, as was remarked by our friend, that it needs to be balanced by appropriate intervention by the state. And what is it that we really need to look at it? Now let me come back to the point very briefly and then close. The question about poverty. I think Simon Kuznets in 1950s writing about the developments the world over did say in the early period of development the inequality may rise. People have written about inequality coefficient and John has quoted extensively from them. First of all, in India, the income data is very doubtful. The only safe data that are available are the consumption expenditure through the National Sample Survey. And you look at it, the National Sample Survey does not show any substantial increase in inequality. Yes, there is inequality, greater inequality in wealth, because that is part of legacy, and that will happen. In fact, my argument will be that if you want to look at the performance of the economy in terms of the social development, you must look at some criteria like poverty ratio and see how it has been behaving. John mentioned about the reduction from 40% to 27%. John did not mention that I was the last man, the last committee that was appointed to look at the poverty ratio. And I also gave a report in 2014 on the poverty ratio. The idea is poverty can be defined in a number of ways. We look many committees that have been looked into the matter, looked at the minimum calorie requirements of the people, and then accordingly decided the level of consumption expenditure that is required. There is enough evidence to show that the poverty ratio comes down much faster during a period of rapid economic growth. In fact, I have the numbers. I will not bother you with too many numbers, but I think between the period of 2009-10 to 2011-12, the poverty ratio came down by 8.7 points. Either you take my method or the Tendulkar method, it gives the same, more or less the same numbers. Even if you raise the poverty ratio or the level of poverty to a higher level, you see a drop in it. Therefore, I would suggest that we need to look at some concept like a poverty ratio, trace its phenomenon, rather than look at the inequality coefficients and so on and so forth. I think this is our numbers are not firm enough to be able to be precise on that. And we also found out that bulk of the people who are below the poverty line, because people talk about the depth of poverty as against what is called the head count ratio. Bulk of the people are around that poverty line, below that poverty line, and therefore any attempt to raise the to bring down the poverty ratio would be the most appropriate method to do it. But having said that, I would also say there are some areas in which we really need to bring about significant changes. And I do appreciate the National Healthcare Scheme that has been proposed in the budget. But unfortunately, the budget lacks details. It is not very clear how this is going to be brought about. It says it will cover 10 crore families, which means 50 crore people. And one doesn't know how exactly it is going to be done, whether it is an insurance scheme or the public health itself will provide the facilities. There are two things that are implicit there. One is a cost, and the other is whether we have the adequate facilities to take care of the people. Both needs to be looked at. Let me conclude. In many ways, the coming decade will be crucial for India. If only India grows at 8 to 9% per annum, India's per capita income will grow from the current level of $1,600 to $8,000 by 2030. Growth is important because it is the answer, in my opinion, to many of our socio-economic problems. If you look back, you will find that many of the social safety net programs that we organized in the recent period, such as the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, National Rural Health Mission, Extended Food Security, all were possible during the time at which the economy is growing fast. What we need is a twofold approach. Letting the economy grow fast and utilizing the surpluses to addressing the problems of the vulnerable and the others disadvantaged. It is this twofold approach which, in my opinion, will be the answer to our problems. Development has many dimensions. It has to be inclusive. It must lead to the reduction of poverty. It must be environment friendly. All these needs to be built into the growth process. But growth is important because growth is the answer to many of our socio-economic problems. Reforms are not ends in themselves. Not even growth is an end in itself. Growth triggered by reforms must be shared by all. Equity and efficiency should not be posed as opposing considerations. They must be viewed into an acceptable pattern of development. Therein lies, if I may say so, economic statesmanship. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for that very insightful address. I'm sure there are tremendous takeaways for all of us here. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Dr. Heribert Dieter is Senior Fellow Research. Dr. S. Narayan, IAS retired, is the former Finance Secretary, Government of India, and he has been in public service in the state and central governments in development administration for nearly 4 decades. He was the economic advisor to the Prime Minister and was responsible for implementation of economic policies of over 30 ministries. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. S. Narayan, IAS retired, as I invite him to address the gathering.
Dr. Rangarajan, dignitaries on the dais, it's absolutely impossible to follow, a speech like that, I think it's covered all the aspects, the problems, the solutions, the concerns, the anxieties, and the way forward. So, in some ways, there's very little for me to talk about, except that I would start with just a couple of thoughts which have not come up so far. And the first of these relates to energy. I think this in our context, the kind of growth that we are looking at, energy is going to pose a major concern. The reason is that we import nearly 80% of all our primary energy needs, whether it's petroleum or it is coal. From the year 2000, our energy consumption has doubled. And even taking a moderate growth of 6 to 7%, it's going to grow 2.5 times and maybe 3 times by the year 2035, 2040. Today we import close to about 3.5 million barrels of oil a day. At moderate estimates, this is going to go to 7.5 million by 2035, 2040. Today we use about 500 to 600 million tons of coal in a year. At moderate estimates, this would go to 1 billion tons of coal. The arguments about use of coal are purely becoming environmental arguments, saying that carbon emissions, what is going to sustainability of the environment, etc. But coal is being used only for power generation. Today it accounts for 50% of power generation, or rather 55% of power generation, with the thrust which is being given on solar and other energies. It will go down to 40% by 2035-40. But coal is not the only worry. The worry is oil. Because if Mr. Indigo and Mr. SpiceJet are ordering 100 planes for each of them, if we are going to have 13 or 14 new ports coming up, oil is going to be used in transportation. Today I do not know whether you know that Chennai is one of the fastest growing cities for two-wheelers. Today we have 45 lakh two-wheelers in the city, which is almost one for every two people, and it's growing at 18% a year. How are we going to manage? And I do hear the government glibly talking about electric vehicles, conversion to power vehicles. But let's not forget that even if all oil vehicles have to be converted to electric vehicles, the electric vehicles require electricity. So you go back to the problem of how are you going to generate that electricity? Out of coal, which is again imported. Can you have so many solar parks or let us say nuclear power stations? I think this is a big elephant in the room that I think we are not looking at adequately while we are moving forward. And I have some suggestions about what is possible to be done. I think the other big point that perhaps we are not looking at adequately is really the problem of global warming. Seriously, our agriculture and agroclimatic zones are getting affected, and we can see it year after year. In Tamil Nadu, the sugar industry has probably another 5 to 10 years to go. Forgive me, madam. After that, it will be no sugar here. Because water will be such a difficult problem. Already water is affecting all our paddy farmers, all our water crops. And you can see that the pollution levels in Delhi, I mean here Chennai we are lucky because of the sea, a lot of pollution goes away. The pollution levels in Delhi and whole of the northern belt is rising not necessarily because of coal, but also because of the kind of a dust that industrialization, that transportation, that lorries and trucks are producing in the environment. Again, this is a large problem that we are not looking at adequately. Neither do I see a kind of a strategy to tackle this, because I think for this we have only about 15 or 20 years to go before we tackle this. The kind of growth that we envisage. Now, for example, I cannot understand why a Prime Minister does not have a Sustainable Development Advisory Council. Why should all advice be only economic? Why should it not be with reference to the environment? Are we not there already? Bringing us down to the kind of development path that we must move forward in. You would have seen in today's newspapers that farmers of Krishnagiri, of western Northargarh district, dumping all their tomatoes on the side of the road. And you and I are aware that 1 year ago, tomatoes were selling close to 80 rupees a kilogram. So to say that we are getting policies right, I think, is not right. Why have we not been able to balance out? And we cannot rely on the market alone. We can rely on the market alone to clear at a normal price, provided all things fall into place. That is, the APMC Act should not be there. There should be freedom of movement. There should be storage facility. There should be an open auction where price discovery takes place. Nothing is happening. And agriculture today, the distress in agriculture today, I would like to submit, is definitely due to the failure of not following through on the Green Revolution. At the time of the Green Revolution, in order to create enough cereals for consumption, a very detailed structure went right from the Ministry of Agriculture, from Mr. C. Subramaniam, who was there, right down to the ground. That includes technology from the agriculture universities, agriculture extension officers at the ground level who used to interact with the farmers, crop information, development of new hybrid seeds, not just for wheat but different kinds of rice as well. But once we received self-sufficiency in food grains, we have forgotten about agriculture. During 2008 or 2009 budget, the Finance Minister, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, did mention that we are going to, I think, that is a speech, that we are going to go for a second revolution in agriculture. And that revolution should come out primarily through technology, logistics, connectivity, most importantly providing this agro-processing zones which would create, why is there that prices in the United States of America for horticulture and food crops do not fluctuate in the manner that they do in India? And that is because the market is not clearing uniformly across the country. And this, I would say, is a fundamental flaw in our policy for the last 10, 15, 20 years. And this flaw is aggravating rural distress, is aggravating the people who are dependent on agricultural incomes, though they may be doing other service sector jobs also. Another concern I have, and again I would call it a policy failure, is during the year 2017 up to now, 43 lakh crores have been made in the financial markets, equity and bond market, 43 lakh crores. And we know the participation in the financial markets is only about 2% of the population. And the financial markets essentially are merely relating to transfer of ownership. I sell the shares to you, you sell the shares to somebody else. The GDP, addition to GDP, only comes out of a few people who are working as brokers or something. What is the value added? The PE ratios have gone from 20 to nearly 44. So to say that the distortion caused by the financial market has not resulted in inequality, I think is also not correct. I participate in the board of 3 or 4 companies, major companies. And I see when I sit on the board that their surplus funds, they would rather allocate it to a financial instrument rather than putting it back into their business. Because the returns available today in the financial business, in the markets, are certainly higher than the returns they would get in their own business. So how would we have investments in business? How can we have further development of business? Again, we have to look back and say, perhaps there are some wrong policies there. For example, in the sugar industry today, after many years, the farmers have started getting good prices, the businesses have started getting good prices. And we have an announcement that they're going to import sugar. Immediately price fall by 6-7 rupees last month. There are other areas. I think there is an increasing literature, if not literature comments, that is coming about. That there are a number of policies after 1991 which have led to this lopsided growth. They talk about crony capitalism. They talk about, a lot of comments are coming out. I have not seen any detailed analysis of any particular sector. But we can certainly imagine 1 or 2 of the mistakes made. For example, let me give just 1 or 2 examples. The development finance institutions, that is IDBI, ICICI, FCA, were closed down. And the project lending functions was left entirely to the public sector banks or to the private sector banks. The ICICI and IDBI, as they were formed, as they existed prior to 1991, had in them enormous amount of expertise that had gathered on project financing, on project risks, on looking at projects in the long term. Today you have a situation where a consortium of banks, starting at one end from the Tamil Nadu Mercantile Bank right up to State Bank of India, 18-20 banks put together lent to a project which is being appraised by one of the 20 who is appraising enormous, from power projects to let us say fertilizer projects. And I would submit that the problems of the banking sector are a function of this short-sighted policy of doing away with development finance institutions, which had concentrated knowledge and concentrated expertise and dispersing it amongst a group of people where due diligence has not been performed. We can see day after day we are seeing. And I have a pet policy problem which I must put before you. For the IT sector, a section called Section 10A or something was introduced, where if you are in a software industry, the industry would get 10 years tax exemption. That was extended by another 10 years, 20 years. This means everybody working, all those industries, including whether you're BPO selling insurance or telling your car is ready for servicing. All those industries got income tax exemption for 15 or 20 years. The argument was, okay, it's an employment-oriented, educated people will go in for employment, they would grow there. I always keep saying, how is that worker more valuable than a person who is making let's say an aircraft part for HAL. He's not getting, that company is not getting income tax exemption. So lopsided policies have definitely affected the current structure of the economy, and it's, I think, very, very high time that some corrective is taken. That we really look at some of the policies and say, have we picked the right winners, or have picking these winners resulted in 300 people becoming billionaires and 3 million people becoming $2 people? I think this question we cannot walk away from anymore. And therefore, I like the fact that in the finance minister's budget speech this year, there's only one line which mentions GDP growth. Growth does not, in India, does not deliver equity, has not delivered equity. And the problems that you are seeing, you know, in Maratha, you had a fight between the Dalits and the Marathas about a war which occurred 200 years ago. I mean, does it make sense? But that's a frustration arising out of lack of livelihood. The Patel agitation is lack of livelihood. The Jat agitation is lack of livelihood. I don't think that these people will wait 15 years, they will wait 20 years for a solution. Tamil Nadu that way is extremely lucky. We talk about balance between development and welfare. Extremely lucky because the kind of programs that have been introduced here have been running successfully. We have run the midday meal program for 35 years now. I know I was there when the initial criticisms from the world, from the center, from the World Bank. But through all this program today is lauded all over the world. Much more than that, it is providing opportunities for the girls in the rural areas to access to education. I have with my own eyes seen that in a midday meal center, 12 to 14-year-old girls would come after the school is over to get a meal, because that is the only meal they would get. And they are children now you see in Tamil TV who are aggressively talking about their rights. They are performing well in exams. Every one of these programs, whether it's a textbook, whether it's the notebooks, giving cycles to the girl children, giving laptops. But of course, sometimes they go off the line, they give 4 goats and all that. I don't buy all that, no. But the originally conceptualized programs were programs which provided a social net. The public distribution system here delivers 20 kilograms of rice in spot after spot after spot, irrespective of whether it's a DMK government or an ADMK government. And that is the reason why, in spite of the poor development, within inverted commas, parameters of the state in the last 4 or 5 years, in spite of the political problems that are happening here, the society is comparatively in balance. That societal equality or societal opportunities are much better here. The public health system is one of the best in the country. The doctors go to the primary health centers. So it is possible for government to deliver. So what am I actually saying? I'm saying just 3 things. One, some if not all or several policies of economic development in the past have been wrong. We need to look at them. 2, we need to reimagine agriculture, bring back a second green revolution, a second technology revolution. 3, you are all MSME people. Very little. You look at the last 15 or 20 years. I just give you one last example before. Just look at Bangladesh. I always compare Bangladesh. 1991, it was a basket case. Then it accepted all kinds of aid and support that it came. Good, bad, didn't matter. It became a darling of the donors for 10 years. Fundamentally, they did one thing for the garment industry. Free import of equipment, skills, management, as well as all the, except that labor should be theirs. Today, it's a much, much bigger importer than India. Clearly, in fact, between 92 and 95, I think I would have written several suggestions to the textile ministry saying just look at Bangladesh. They are going to go far ahead of India the next 20 years because they've got their policies right. Here we are worrying about whether yarn should be protected, handloom should be protected, or khadar should be made into dress shirts. Even today there's the different powerloom versus handloom fight go on. In all parameters, welfare parameters, sanitation parameters, women's health parameters, population and contraception parameters, Bangladesh is ahead of us today. So certainly we have got certain things wrong, but certainly there's an opportunity to correct it. Because if we know we are wrong, we can correct it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your views. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Dr. Heribert Dieter is Senior Fellow, Research Unit Global Issues, German Institute for International and Security Affairs, Berlin. Let us take the benefit of his presence and invite his comments.
Yeah, thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers, MMA and the Adenauer Foundation for facilitating my stay here. It's particularly nice to leave Berlin in early March when temperatures are about 35 degrees lower than here. So I very much like to be back, and I would like to have a few comments because I'm the last speaker. The comments shouldn't be too long, and they should cover something that hasn't been discussed yet, which is a bit difficult, but I think I find a few spots. Let me first of all just make a very brief comment on Dr. Jarman's mobility issues. I think this part of the world would be ideally placed to have electric two-wheelers powered with solar power. You have solar power in abundance, and of course those scooters are relatively cheap, and they are not high-tech, and they are pollution-free, and you don't have to import coal if it's done with solar power. So that is just a brief comment on this mobility issue. My comment in greater detail will be looking at the global economy, because the Indian economy will not develop in isolation from what is happening in the rest of the world. And when I first came to India, which was in late 2006, we had a conference on the future of globalization. We always discuss the future of globalization. It's a topic that never runs out of fashion. And we had that conference at the Federation of Indian Chambers of Industry and Commerce at FICCI. And the Director General at the time was asking a question which, with hindsight, was a very well-placed question. He asked whether the writings of Rudolf Hilferding, an economist long forgotten in Germany, from 1910, in which Rudolf Hilferding described financial capitalism as the last stage of development of capitalism before it collapses, whether this assessment is still valid. And a few months later, as we have seen, the world was close to collapsing, at least financial markets were close to collapsing. This year, on the 15th of September, we will have the anniversary, the 10th anniversary of the collapse of Lehman. 20 years ago, we had the Asian financial crisis, which is my question. Where are we standing with regard to financial stability in 2018? And that's a question that affects India, that's a question that affects Europe, that's a question that, of course, affects the United States and China. So the simple question is, what has happened to risk? Has risk increased? Or is the financial system just better managed and better regulated? Well, I have one witness, and that very witness is a colleague of yours, is the former governor of the Chinese Central Bank. And this gentleman a few months ago said, well, we might be approaching what economists call a Minsky moment. And a Minsky moment, in plain English, is a phase in the development of an economy which is characterized by a willingness of market participants to engage in very risky endeavors. People are too confident. They don't see the risks. They seem to think that all investments will be beneficial. Well, this is a statement from a man who presided over the monetary policy of China, and he knows what he's talking about. We have a level of risk development which we don't fully understand. And in particular, in the heart of that problem is not the OECD, and it's also this time not the Americans. It is, of course, China that has probably borrowed too much. We have seen that since 2008, the Chinese economy has grown, debt in China has grown much faster than the Chinese economy, and that is a point of concern. The British journal, The Economist, has asked the question, and it's of course for the time being a question. They've asked the question whether China is a giant Ponzi scheme. Now, this is a rather shocking assessment. If China is a giant Ponzi scheme, it means the system is staying afloat with ever new injections of liquidity. I'm not saying they are right, but at least it is a question we should consider. And I give you one figure, which I find quite interesting and frightening at the same time. The debt of state-owned enterprises in China currently stands at 170% of Chinese GDP. This is not including all other debt, and Chinese government debt is low, but that figure alone is a bit frightening. Now, many people have ruined their career by predicting that China will be in trouble at some stage, and I'm not going to do that. It is a risky business, but we should not exclude the possibility that this may happen, that a financial crisis may happen, and I think given all the indicators that we have, it could indeed be a problem for the rest of the world. I mean, as much as China has been contributing and has been stimulating global demand in the last 30 years, a lack of demand from China might have very serious and very negative effects, and that is something which is, of course, also of major concern to German companies, which have been so happy to do business in China. It may be time to reflect on that. Just very briefly on India, and I'm always amazed about the level of development in and recent developments in this country. Where I would just like to differ a little bit is your criticism about the lack of investment. It is certainly true that a decline of investment, the rate of investment is something of concern, but seen differently, financial crises have often happened because there was too much borrowing abroad. Investment was financed with foreign capital. I already mentioned the Asian financial crisis. This was a time when in 1993 the World Bank published this report, the East Asian Economic Miracle. It was indeed a Minsky moment. Everybody was confident. Even German banks lent to Southeast Asian borrowers in 1997, which was a clear signal to get out. When they lent, you better get out. So I'm not so concerned that investment is low. I would rather be concerned if the investment would be financed with fragile money, as the Economist calls it, hot money. A final point on the perspectives of this country. In 2016, there was almost a world survey on globalization. Not a world survey, 24 countries. And citizens in those countries were asked whether globalization is good or not good. And globalization was widely defined, including cultural exchange and ideas and so forth. Well, this country was in the very top league. There were only two countries where people had a greater confidence in globalization, and I would, as an economist, add where citizens had a greater confidence in the international division of labor, which can be so beneficial. In Vietnam, 91% of citizens said globalization is good. In the Philippines, 85%. In India, 83%. This is a remarkable basis on which to build an economy which is modern, which is integrated into the global economy. And a very last point, I dare say that I observe a bit of a change in the perception of globalization, also of global governance in this country, courtesy of Mr. Trump. Because suddenly policymakers in this country seem to be willing to concede and to observe that this is also your globalization that is at risk. And when the Americans are playing funny games, and I think we have seen this week that they are very eager to play funny games, then it is also the task and an opportunity for India to be a constructive player in the management of the global economy. And with those foundations, policymakers that understand what is at stake and a population that is willing to engage in globalization, I think these are very good preconditions for a bright economic future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir, for sharing your comments. May I now request Ms. Kavita Chituri, President MMA, to kindly present a memento. The forum is now open for questions, so in case there are any questions, we can pass on the mic to you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, due to paucity of time, we are not able to take questions. May I request the President MMA to kindly present a memento to our chief guest, Dr. C. Rangarajan. Thank you, sir, for having accepted our invitation to be part of this seminar. To our guest of honor, Dr. Narayanan.